CM 365, all about Carnatic music.
Today we'll be discussing about a very ancient stringed instrument, the yar. This yar was actually used as an instrument by itself as well as an accompaniment to vocal music. Now, coming to the origin of the yar, we see that early man found that when he shot an arrow, the string of the bow gave a musical note. And this is probably the origin of the concept of the yar itself, where we see that a musical sound could be produced by the string of the bow, and the string in a state of tension when pulled and released gave a musical note. This kind of observation actually led to the inventive instincts working within man. And he tied strings of different length to the same bow and noticed that notes of different pitch could be produced. So obviously a smaller string, then the slightly bigger sized strings attached to it. So when there were strings of various length, he could sense that different kinds of tones could be produced. This discovery paved the way for developing what we call as the harp or the yar. Of course, in South India, this is typically called as the yar. By attaching a hollow boat-shaped resonator to the section of the bow, the tone was found to increase in volume. That concept of resonance, which gave rise to more volume, that also he was able to discover through this. Since the tip of the dundee or stem of the instrument was carved into the head of a weird animal yali, it came to be known as yar. And the yar was actually played on open strings, unlike the veena, which we see is fretted today. We see that at that time the yar basically had open strings, and polyphonous instrument as more than one note could be played at the same time. The yar was played with fingers of both the hands and tuned to a particular scale. It was tuned to a particular pitch and or scale, and after that, arriving at different other scales came through the process of the modal shift of tonic. That is, by changing the tonic note, they were able to derive different kinds of scales from it. Now, there are different varieties of yar mentioned in our literature itself, based on the number of strings that the instrument had. For example, the Peri yar had 21 strings. The Makara yar had 19. Sagoda yar had 14. Then there is also mention of the Maruthu yar and Adi yar, which happens to be mentioned in the Tamil literature as having 1,000 strings. And there is also, interestingly, the mention of one yar called Yama yar, that is named after the tortoise whose shape it actually took. Now, though the yar was existent for quite some time in the music scenario, because of the limitations that it posed, it has to make its exit. Of course, after that, the veena took over prominently, and the veena had many more advantages which the yar didn't have. So we see that in any system, it's the survival of the fittest. So when the veena came into the scene, the yar had quite a few limitations. For example, in the yar, you could not play the gamakas. That was the first problem. Only plain notes could be played and you could play the gamakas. Nor could one play the quarter tones, or that is the semitones, which are very, very important to our Carnatic music. And we also see that here, once the concept of the Adara Shadja came, this concept of modal shift of tonic and other things became quite obsolete. There was no need, because once the Adara Shadja was established and the Saptaswaras were derived, and further the classification varieties of notes came in, after that the concept of this shifting of the basic note to arrive at different scales actually did not serve any purpose at all. And we also see that the basic scale, which I talked about earlier, about to which the yar is tuned, was Harikambode. And by shifting of the tonic note, we see that other scales were derived. Then we also see that based on the geographic region in which it originated. The yar is again classified in the Tamil literature as Palai yar, Maruda yar, Mullai yar, Kurunji yar, Neidal yar, and so on. And we see that the ancient yar, what kind of purpose it served then? That is, in the context of that period when the yar was existent, what was its contribution towards the music? We see that the ancient yar helped the scholars to comprehend the nature of the consonant and dissonant notes, the frequency ratio of notes, the harmonic series, and the method of deriving scale by the process of modal shift of tonic. This was very, very important in the sense that how when you shift one note and that becomes the Adhara Shadja, what are the subsequent scales that can be derived by this modal shift of tonic. This was a very important contribution, I would say, on the part of the yar. But of course, the fretted veena, however, threw the yar into the background as it had facilities mainly, for stopping the playing strings. That was one thing. For execution of all the kinds of gamakas that we sing, that is in vocal music, whatever gamakas are there, that could be codified well through the help of the veena, where we see that in fact all the gamakas that we talk about today can be well implemented on the veena. So that was a big advantage it had as an instrument. And by the deflection of strings, different kinds of shades of the notes, the gamakas, everything could be implemented. Thus we see that though the veena is predominantly what it took over after the yar, at that time when the yar was there, it did have a major contribution, I would say, in terms of the growth of music, in terms of understanding the notes, in terms of deriving different scales. So that way, it is indeed a very, very important contribution as an instrument, I would say, towards the growth of Carnatic music.
CM 365, all about Carnatic music.